network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are transitioning for a short period of time from the Big 12 to the Big 10, where an exciting young player who made a name for himself at Ole Miss is just transferred to Ohio State and really strengthened a unit that looks like one of the best offenses in the country. And this young man, we talk about running backs in college football, should be the name on everyone's list. And I'm hearing that there's so many cheat codes with him concerning CFB 25, the new video game, and he certainly seems like he can be a cheat code for Ohio State. And he's really going to be one of the most dangerous players in the country. So without further ado, let's transition right into the fantasy football player profile of Quinshon Judkins. Now, what I love about Quinshon Judkins is that at Ole Miss, it really was not necessarily going to be predicated around him, the offense. I think that Lane Kiffin definitely wanted a lot of verticality in the passing game, and Jack Sedart did offer that. We talked about him yesterday. But Quinshon Judkins just made himself available for this team in so many different ways, and with it, he could not be denied. He's a player who immediately makes your offense much more dangerous, much more fearsome, much more varied. And now, going to Ohio State, who we've talked about loads in the past in the show, who's a team now that looks like one of the best in the country, and perhaps the betting favorite to win the whole damn thing. Quinshon Judkins just profiles as someone who's primed for success no matter where he goes. And so let's just jump right into why Quinshon Judkins could potentially be the RB1 in fantasy college football. 1,158 yards, 15 TDs, 149 receiving yards, and 2 TDs in the past couple of years. Over 2,725 yards and 31 rush TDs in the past 2 seasons that he played at Ole Miss. His best performance was 30.6 points last year against LSU. A fantastic game if you remember that game, a shootout. 33 carries, 177 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 receiving touchdown as well. His worst game was against ULM. Only 18 carries for 65 yards, but who cares? That best performance really has to stand out for you. 30 points for a running back is not too shabby. But now let's talk about him in the terms of the profile he brings to Ohio State. You look at Ohio State. They're well set up in the wide receiver group. They have a stellar defense, who we often forget to talk about and appreciate on this show. But it all comes down to that backfield, right? You bring in Will Howard from Kansas State to really lead this team. You expect him to do big things, and it's probably the bridge quarterback to exciting young quarterbacks in Devin Brown and Julian Saint. And then you bring in one of the most explosive running backs in college football in Quinshon Judkins. I think that dynamic speaks to what Ryan Day might want to translate this offense to, because Quinshon Judkins certainly profiles as a weird pick if you bring in the context of the profile of Will Howard, because Will Howard is certainly a safer quarterback than Ohio State has ever had. I think that there's not going to be as much pressure on him as people think, because they really don't know if he has the goods to really bring out the best in this wide receiver group. And so, in that context, perhaps Quinshon Judkins' reputation as a rusher might not come into play. However, you also have to combine that with the fact that maybe Ryan Day is taking a very tactful approach with his wide receiver core. I think that in recent years, they've all been trying to get the ball to guys like Marvin Harrison Jr. and things of that nature, and really puts a lot of pressure on him. And so, by adding Quinshon Judkins to this team, it certainly adds a dimensionality in which you can run the ball a little bit more, thus opening up more avenues for Will Howard to feel comfortable. And that's what matters to me in terms of this Ohio State offense. In terms of fantasy, I think that Quinshon Judkins kind of loses value as a receiver, but it's not as exponential as the value he's going to gain as a rusher, because he's going to be a more valuable rusher. A lot of the things that people like in fantasy stem far beyond stats. It extends to whether you're a running back, yards after contact, extends to yards per route run and stuff like that. So the depth that Quinshon Judkins brings to the position, that's something that you have to consider too. There's a certain depth. What I mean by depth for a guy like Quinshon Judkins is he brings this running style, this connectivity that bridges between the run and pass game, that allows for an offense to click. Because we think about him at Ole Miss, he certainly had his share of long runs where he just ran all the way to the end zone. When I think about what he did at Ole Miss, it certainly alleviated a lot of the pressure and dynamics on Jackson Dart, because when you think about all these teams trying to get to the deep pass, the promised land, nirvana, for a quarterback, it's a whole building process. There's building blocks to it. And when I think about deep ball passers in recent memory, Will Howard does not fit into that profile for me. However, for that even to be a possibility, perhaps, for a guy of Will Howard's nature, you need a running back who just bridges the divide between the run and pass game so well, because he can either take it all the way to the promised land himself, or he just gives you enough to really get your passing game going. Now let's talk about that passing game. In this wide receiver room, there certainly does feel like there are roles divvied out here. You have Emeka Egbuka, who's going to be the route runner guy, the savvy, intelligent guy, the guy who has quick hands, quick feet, who's always going to be more knowledgeable than the defender defending him. Then you have the two youngsters, in sophomore Carnell Tate and freshman Jeremiah Smith, who really bring a speed and this explosive dynamic to them. And I think that it will fit well if Will Howard goes early and often to Emeka Egbuka, because if you combine the savvy intelligence of Emeka Egbuka, the speed and dynamism of Smith and Tate, and then add Quinshon Judkins to the equation, I think that's very scary. Now, it also all depends on how Ryan Day decides to develop Will Howard as a passer. Does he really want Will Howard to throw the ball deep, or does he want more variety in that Quinshon Judkins is reliable? And let's not forget, Quinshon Judkins shares a running back room with Travion Henderson, another player who is much like him. He offers that power at the running back position, but also can break off and score in bunches. So, the variety of this Ohio State offense is scary, but it could also be scary in a negative way as well if the whole profile of it gets kind of mixed up in the process of figuring out, well, how do we get all these players to coalesce together? How do we get this group to kind of figure out its roles and make it so that everything balances out and make our offense that much more dynamic? And so, the conundrum that faces Ohio State is this. Is Will Howard going to be predicated on getting the ball down deep vertically, which could favor guys like Smith and Tate? Will he value a receiver who's very experienced, and let alone experienced in the system, in Emeka Egbuka? How are you going to view your backfield? Which of these guys do you value more? Who's going to get the load of the carries? Is Quinshon Judkins really going to be as explosive as we remember him? Is Travion Henderson going to become more of a workhorse back? And all these questions pile and pile up. And if they don't get answered, the concern for Ohio State is that they're really wasting the potential they have here. Because everything works. There is a set dynamic. It seems very hierarchical in nature. Everyone understands their role. It seems like, by some divine nature, everything seems defined. But the caveat is Quinshon Judkins. Quinshon Judkins himself, and let me tell you why. He doesn't necessarily throw a wrench into the plans of Ohio State, but incorporating him into this offense, while certainly brings a fearsome quality to it, also adds to the seed of doubt that probably was in Ryan Day's mind when, of all players in the transfer portal, he chose Will Howard. Because this season for Ohio State, I don't necessarily believe is about winning the CFP, or even beating Michigan for that matter. It's about the future of this program. I think that it was a shrewd move to pick up Will Howard, and it could work. But he also wanted someone to cover up the tracks should Will Howard underperform. And Quinshon Judkins being added to this group, another dynamic player in this offense, really brings into perspective the kind of desperation that Ryan Day possessed in that moment. If you truly believed that Will Howard was the guy, then why did you go out and pick up a dynamic running back? I think that this tells a story of underlying kind of self-doubt in Ohio State. They failed to beat Michigan in recent memory. They haven't really cemented themselves as a consistent CFP contender just yet for the 12-team college football playoff. And now that the Big Ten is just going to continue getting better and better, Oregon's there now. I think Washington still can't be left out of the discussion. Of course, Michigan can't be left out of the discussion. What about Penn State? Will they get better? Is this move going to define the start of Ohio State's tenure in the Big Ten and the CFP? Which move will prove to be more astute? The move for Will Howard in a year where everyone expects you to win, or the move for Quinshon Judkins as kind of a facade to cover everything up? I'm not saying the Ohio State offense isn't as set in stone as people think. I'm just saying that there seems to be a lot of underlying subliminal kind of messages sent through the decision making of this Ohio State staff and organization. And I think that Quinshon Judkins certainly adds a huge element to this offense that might have not been there before. But he also adds a sense of desperation. In terms of fantasy, I still think he'll be absolutely fantastic. But in what ways will he negatively impact this team if him and Will Howard don't work out as the backfield? But we'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we transition back to the Big 12 and another running back who probably is the best running back in the country, has a lot of pressure on his shoulders for an Oklahoma State team looking to do big things. We'll be back to talk about him right after this break.